everybody, and welcome. I'm Diane Stern, a trustee at the Athenaeum. And I want to thank you first off, if you went to the wonderful fundraiser that we had, our Tardy Marty party on Saturday. Thank you so much for supporting the Athenaeum Research. Tonight's presentation will perhaps make you more intentional about what you buy. Whether it's clothes, household items, really whatever, chances are that item was made in another country. My end of season sale, Eddie Bauer coat was made in China, just as an example. Rachel Slade is the award-winning author of Into the Raging Sea. She's a former staff editor and writer for Boston Magazine and the Boston Globe. You may have seen this article. A recent one makes the case for turning now empty office buildings into small manufacturing spaces. I find that fascinating. So, in her book, Making It in America, and we have several copies, Rachel takes a deep dive into the history of manufacturing in the United States and why these days, quote, Americans don't make things. It's too messy and complicated. But she will share the inspiring story of a couple in Maine whose mission was to make all American sourced clothing. So that means from the beginning, the cloth, right to the end. This couple is amazing, but we'll hear more about them. Rachel is joined in conversation tonight by historian and award-winning author Catherine Allgor, who is president of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Catherine has been a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and a visiting professor of history at Harvard. President Obama appointed her to the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation, a presidential commission. So without further ado, and hello also to the people on Zoom, I would like to introduce you both to Catherine and to Rachel. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. Why did we not get invited to that party, Marty?
I know, right?
Yeah.
You're next year.
So,
Please.
so terrible. So this is an inappropriate way to begin a hard-hitting, in-depth interview. So I'm going to apologize. Rachel, your book is so good. Really is good. So it is, as you were saying, at the heart, it's this story of one family who determines to bring back and revive a small fraction of domestic manufacturing. So that's the heart of the book. It's a big chunk of the book. But and it's a compelling story. But what you also do in the book is that you include history and, economic theory, economic policy, political, theory. But you do it so deftly, and it's really on a need-to-know basis. So you're reading along, and you kind of go up and you're reading along, and you sort of like, how did we get there? Oh, I see. Okay. And just as we kind of need to know. So it's really just, obviously a great topic, but in the hands of a great writer. All right. Speaking of writing and speaking of making things, I always assume that people in an audience like this want to write a book. I mean, I just know they do. So I wonder if you could just start talking to us really as a writer, what brought you to this project, and maybe a little bit about your research writing process.
Absolutely, yeah.
People will be taking notes for tips.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's an honor. Thank you, Catherine, for joining me. We just became friends. So very brave of Catherine to show up and do this with me. So thank you. And it's an honor to be here. I just wanted to say also that I was supposed to be here doing Into the Raging Sea right when the pandemic hit. So I missed that opportunity. And so I'm so glad. Basically, I wrote a second book just so I could be here 4 years later. So thank you for coming here tonight. I do appreciate it. So I was trained as an architect. I practiced as an architect for a long time. Not 5 years, that's not a long time. But as an architect, I learned how important it is to work hand in hand with the people who are building things and to know how to build things yourselves to a certain extent. Architects, some of them can build, some of them can't, but like getting into it, right? And I learned that you really can't innovate unless you know how to make to a certain extent, or you know how to talk to the people who fabricate to a great extent, right? And so the greatest architects in the world like Renzo piano, if we have any architect fans here. We did the addition to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, for example. You know, fabulous architect. He has a whole workshop. The whole workshop is dedicated to modeling and prototyping and developing new uses of materials. And so he's an incredible innovator for that very reason. Those are the kinds of architects I wish did more work in Boston. Unfortunately, that's a whole different story. So that's my tradition. That's always been my sensibility. It's like, if you want something, make it if you can, figure it out. My mother made things, I made things. When I was little and I didn't have siblings, I actually made a friend. Like anyway, I knit, I build furniture. So that's always been my sensibility. And so ever since I was little, I've always like taking my clothes, turning them inside out, finding tags, where is this thing made? And of course, when I was little in the 70s, everything was made in the US. And because I was so in tune with that, I was very much aware of what was happening as the world was changing around me. It wasn't something I understood in terms of like the political impact, but I could see starting in the 90s, if you went through like late 90s, if you went through a stack of Gap t-shirts, for example, they might be one stack, identical t-shirts, they might be from like 5 different countries, right? So this is something I'm starting to think about. And then, you know, I start to become more politically aware. Now I'm in my 30s, late 30s, 40s, and we're starting to see the impact. And these books are starting to come out that are talking about what happens to towns in America when manufacturing leaves. So that's one narrative, right? That's one thing that we're thinking about, is when you have people who are in manufacturing, that's their whole life. I've met people who carried their union cards for 30 years after they lost their jobs and their pensions and everything else. I mean, this is a point of pride. And for many people, especially men, it was very difficult for them to transition from the making economy, the manufacturing economy, to the service economy. Women were generally better statistically. They could make that transition, but for men, it's been different, and that has really shaped the political climate. That's where we are right now, right? And so that's kind of the background as to why I was so exquisitely aware of what was happening. But what I wanted to find, so I wanted to do a book on this, like I really, really did. But I needed to find a company that was doing everything what I would call the right way. And what was right? Like, I'm merciless, right? You should be too. I'm sure you are. You're here. You're educated. You care. You know, it had to be all sourced in America. But not only that, I was looking for a company that was doing things that wasn't backed by private equity. Good luck finding companies that aren't backed by private equity, venture capital. I was looking for people like you and me, like regular people who threw in their lives to make this thing work, and you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, we're going to make this work. I was also looking for people who cared very much about unions, and here's why. If you are making things, if you are producing, if you have a company and you can't afford to take care of the people doing the work, then as far as I'm concerned, you are contributing very little to society. I feel like our responsibility is to all of us. We are part of a large community, United States. There's a larger community in the world, but let's just say we're all part of this large community. I think we need to take care of each other. And I don't think there's any better way to take care of each other than to give people good employment that is meaningful, but also meets their needs. And unions aren't just about, I'm preaching a little bit, but, and please excuse me, unions are not just about getting better pay, right? For many people, it's about getting a 4-day work week, for example, so that you can do your errands on a Friday or a Monday. It's about sick leave. If your children are sick, you can take care of them. And in fact, statistics have shown that then everybody gets better faster. It's about working conditions, making sure that you're working under safe working conditions. It's about being able to control when your shift is, if you're on shift work, so that it doesn't spring on you, and that means you can never plan anything, which is a form of enslavement in a way, right? You're always tied to that schedule, which could be capricious, could change from week to week. So for me, I was looking for a company that like really got this, was committed to making in America, was committed to sourcing in America, and was absolutely committed to the people who were doing the work. And I couldn't believe it. I found them in Maine. It's a small company in Maine. But you asked me about process. So the first process was, you know, basically just having this very strict criteria and spending like pretty much a decade trying to find what I would call a unicorn. And then I had to, and this was where I cut my teeth working on Into the Raging Sea, which is a very upsetting story. It's about a container ship that went down in 2015, killing all 33 people aboard. So part of the problem or the challenge for a journalist is, can you ingratiate yourself to the people who you really need? You know, because if you can't, if they don't trust you, if they're not forthcoming, if they're questioning your agenda, whatever it is, you'll never get the real story. And if you can't get the real story, get out of business. Like, it's not worth it. So I had to ingratiate myself to people who were unlike me in many ways. We shared a lot of the same values, but we had very different backgrounds. And the people working at the company were very different from me too. They had come from, many of them were new Americans. They had come from very difficult places, and I detailed some of that in my book. Places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, which is essentially a failed state. Angola, Vietnam, which is not so bad. Both of my brothers live in Vietnam. But a lot of people coming from Africa. And these are the people who spend years trying to get somewhere, not necessarily America, just somewhere where they can wake up every morning not worrying about whether someone they love is going to die that day. And for them, that's freedom. That's what freedom means. And so we'll get into that a little bit, but so ingratiating myself, that's part of the writing process. And then collecting the stories, gathering the stories, doing a lot of reading. At the Boston Athenaeum, actually, which is my home state. And thinking a lot about how do you bring in all these different things and still make a narrative that's readable, because ultimately I want you to be able to read it and enjoy it. So it needs to be a narrative. And I felt very lucky that I found Ben and Whitney Waxman, who own this company, because I think their journey is fascinating, and I think as characters they're really interesting. So yeah, it's a lot of talking and listening and thinking, and then, you know, you throw down a bunch of words. And then it gets hard to think.
Well, since you've introduced it to Ben and Whitney, I
Yeah.
wonder if we could get you to read a little bit. And I think maybe this is the point where, so Ben and Whitney are sort of together, I think, and you,
Okay.
yeah, were there.
So Ben and Whitney Waxman, they were not married when they first met, but it's fine. They, so Whitney was a bartender. She had actually worked at Hogs and Heifers in New York City. Anybody's familiar?
Yeah.
Kind of like a coyote ugly kind of bar. And she ended up, her journey just left her, dropped her off in Portland, Maine. And she wasn't sure what was next for her. She had already been through a marriage and a divorce. And one day in walks this guy, Ben Waxman. And Ben had worked very high up at the AFL-CIO for 10 years under the legendary president, Rich Trumka, who unfortunately died while I was reporting this book. Ben and Whitney meet. Whitney's not so sure about Ben. Ben is real rough. He's a union guy. He watched all these factories shut because he was working for the AFL-CIO from 2003 to 2013. And it almost broke him. Standing side by side with workers as their factories just shut, as they lose their pensions, as their towns just basically close up and all is lost. He sees all of that and it almost breaks him. He develops a drug addiction and he comes back home to Portland and he's not sure what's next for him. More in the book, but he meets Whitney and here we are in the spring of 2013. So Ben moved in with Whitney in 2013. They were in their mid-30s, seasoned by lives fully lived. Ben's idealism still knew no bounds. He dreamed big. Whitney kept him grounded. She was a realist, but his optimism was rubbing off on her. She never thought of herself as a crusader, but being around Ben sparked a desire in her to leave the world a little better than she found it. She was considering leaving her lucrative bar job. She was ready for the next thing. The dream of reviving American manufacturing consumed Ben. He was passionate about manufacturing because he spent more than a decade with people who once made things and felt pride in producing. When those jobs were shipped abroad, they would never feel fully whole again. Ben felt that unionized manufacturing was the best way to create opportunity and rebuild community. Unions had always offered workers much more than bargaining power. At best, they were sources for thoughtful political analysis, job training, language instruction for non-native speakers, and social events that celebrated cultural differences. Unions squirreled away dues to support workers during strikes and take care of injured workers' families. Some unions even built co-op housing available at affordable prices. At night, Ben stayed up late brainstorming ideas on yellow, illegal pads, confident that somewhere in his ADHD-fueled scroll lay the kernel of a brilliant idea. No proposal was too ambitious. I don't want to go to the party, he told me. I want to throw it. One sweltering August day in 2014, everything came together. Dory, Ben's mother, had restarted her cape and blanket business after spending a few years on Portland City Council, and in a fit of nostalgia, invited Ben to join her on a fabric run, this time to Uxbridge, Massachusetts, where one of the last remaining wool mills in New England continued to produce high-quality fabric. It would be like old times, Dory and Ben driving around New England in a hot van, stinking of wool. Ben's memories flooded back, watching his mother in heated conversations with eccentric mill owners, their voices drowned out by the clacking of looms. He said yes, and he invited Whitney along. Dory pulled the van up to 19th century brick mill complex, once the Stanley Wool Company, along the Blackstone River, 30 miles upriver from Pawtucket, where the first cotton mill in America began operation in 1790. Inside the mill, it was dark and airless, their eyes adjusted, and Ben and Whitney saw just one loom clacking away. At peak production, dozens of looms would have been operating. Whitney was transfixed by the sight. She watched the long pair of heddles bopping up and down at a rapid clip, separating the strands of work yarn to clear the way for the shuttle, which whizzed back and forth, meeting out the weft like a spider on a rocket. Every part of the machine moved at great speed, but the fabric grew inch by inch, one shuttle pass at a time. Nearby, 4 women wearing owlish glasses sat at their crochet machines, by the way, built by Merrow, which is still in operation down in New Bedford, edging thick wool fabric to make wool blankets. They occasionally peered over their thick lenses to study Ben and Whitney, while keeping up a conversation that had been going on for decades. Whitney observed the old canvas rolling carts that once moved raw wool and woven textiles from looms to the fullers, where the fabric was beaten, and to the finishers, where it was napped and snipped. She surveyed the unused power looms idle in the dark, dim light, covered in cobwebs and dust. Surrounded by the materials of the manufacturing age, Whitney felt something spark inside her. She had a visceral sense of the industrious people who once created textiles here, their dreams for themselves and their children. Whitney's thoughts wandered to her family's agricultural roots. She envisioned fields of cotton under the southern sun and herds of sheep on the coast of Maine. She loved thinking about how she could become part of the life cycle of an ancient tradition. And that's the beginning. Yeah.
So I'm not, I have no spoilers, but I'm not giving this away when I say that they have to figure out what they want to make. And one of the delights of the book is them figuring it out. It's going to be, this part isn't a spoiler, it's going to be sweatshirts and the humble hoodie, which we all know what the hoodie is, but can you tell us a little bit about the humble hoodie, because I just saw it in a whole different way.
So I have a whole chapter called The History of the Hoodie, because I think the hoodie is a fantastic garment of clothing. And the fashion editor of the New York Times, I'm blanking on her name at the moment, but she actually had a whole beautiful little essay about what an ingenious garment this is. So let's think about it for a second. Everybody's wearing a hoodie tonight? Thank you.
There we go.
But that's knit.
It's knit.
Yeah, okay, so it's not quite what I'm talking about.
I know.
So does anybody remember?
I have lots of them.
So back in the day, before cotton fleece was invented in 1925, around that time in the South, athletes, when we're talking about like football teams and crew teams, when you think about Yale and Harvard, what did they wear? Wool. They wore wool. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around that, but it was wool knit clothing that they wore. And there was a young man, he was the son of a cotton mill owner in the South. This is Russell. Anybody remember Russell?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And the young man went to college and came back and said to his father, you know, I don't think wool is the best material for athletic wear. And I wonder whether we can't start making athletic clothing instead out of cotton that we're growing right here. And his father was an entrepreneur, and you know he had workers and he had access to cotton, obviously, because they're in the South. And so he started to develop this cotton fabric that was fleeced on the other side. So that's a new innovation, right? So you need to, hello, innovation, right? You need to create in order to innovate. So you knew how to make a cotton knit fabric, which is actually lovely because it's stretchable in many different directions. Unlike a weave, right? A weave actually really isn't stretchable at all. If you know about the process of making a woven piece, you'll understand why. So a knit is like a really wonderful fabric. That's why a lot of us wear knits next to our skin, because it stretches with us. And so the fleece part of it required a double knit. So you have a knit on the outside that's like tightly knit so that it can repel the elements. And on the inside, you have another knit that you actually nap, like we were talking about. Napping is like, you know, you actually break the stitches, you pull it up, you rough it up. And that's what's so soft and lovely about cotton fleece. And that was invented specifically for the athletic wear market, which at the time was very small. Because, by the way, kids were still working in factories. Nobody was running around, right? We didn't have actually child labor laws until around that time. The only people who had time to actually do any kind of athletic activities were Harvard and Yale men. Working people wore woven broadcloths and I mean, use, right, wool, lots of wool. So there was not a large market for this, but that all really changed as child labor laws actually got children going to school, which then started to generate people to go to now these larger colleges and universities that were developing everywhere, flowing everywhere. And then it took Rochester, New York. Now we're Champion. You remember Champion?
Yes.
Owned by Jewish brothers. Rochester was Jews and Italians. The South was other. They actually got the idea. They were starting to make the crew neck sweatshirt. They were copying Russell. they got the idea to put a hood on this thing. Because, why not? Right? When you're up here in the north, you need to stay warm, slap that hood on, put a drawstring in it, maybe put a zipper in it, now you have a jacket, and now you have working man's clothing. And then we get, on the waterfront, then we get Rocky, then we get people, working men and women who are wearing this garment that was originally designed for the athletic industry, now becomes the working man's garment. And then hip hop, 1980, 1990, the idea that you could become anonymous, right? Throw this thing over. Now, apparently, this is not in my book, but apparently, I don't think it's in my book. But apparently, part of the reason that hoodies became part of hip hop culture was because Russell and Champion actually had discount stores like seconds or runoffs or overruns or something in New York City. And so, and Rochester and other places where you had hip hop developing. And so the kids would like go to those stores and they would get these garments at deep discount and then like silk screen them, do all kinds of stuff with them to make them their own. And so the idea that, you could like put this thing on and hide who you were or take it off and get your blinky back. I mean, it all became part of hip hop culture and then everything just, the hoodie takes off. And then we start seeing Mark Zuckerberg in 1910. How dare he go to these, board meetings, billion-dollar company, maybe not back then, with his hoodie. And then my favorite example of hoodie wear is my first love, President Macron of France. I don't know if you remember, but during the pandemic, he's actually was shot wearing very handsome black hoodie. And I said, okay, well, now it's in France and the president of France is wearing it. So thank you, America.
Didn't you also say in your like one of the earliest known garments that we have is this sort of hoodie?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, the idea of having a garment with a hood goes way back because, there was a time when people really only had one garment.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that you actually need a closet is a crazy thing, right? Like early homes didn't even have closets. You'd have a case piece or something. They would throw maybe your wedding garment in or your desk strap in or something like that. But yeah, so you needed an all-purpose garment, and so of course it would have a hood.
Perfect. Yeah.
Right?
You don't have to tell us around here about your closets. So let me tell you, I'm enjoying the book. I'm reading, the trials, the tribulations, the decisions, and then we get to the chapters on the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, this is where you're a terrific writer. This is where this did not pay off for me. I got the suspense. So there's a level of suspense through all of this, which is really like what's going to happen to these people. And then 2020 hit, and I just had to put the book down for just a little while. Because what I saw when I realized we were heading into a pandemic is what Ben says, and I just want to read for a second. So he's in CNN, he at that moment when we all figured out something was really going on, that we all remember that moment, that he's away from home. He's suddenly found out his wife, Whitney, is sick now. So he's suddenly realizing this is a thing. Ben hits the back of the envelope, math in the airport with CNN running in the background. American Roots had about 2 payrolls cash in the bank. Their monthly overhead was $100,000, including rent, salaries, healthcare, and debt service. If they hadn't shut down for a few months, they were not going to make it. They'd have to sell dozens of industrial sewing machines and lay off the workforce they patiently trained to become professional apparel workers. If they closed down indefinitely, Ben figured there would be no American Roots. And of course, I'm reading this knowing they're going to have to more than a couple of months. They spent nothing on marketing, had no online presence, and relied solely on face-to-face relationship building. I'm a sales guy. That's what I am. I like selling our story, mission, and product, Ben says. And at that point, I didn't know what we were going to do, and neither did I. So I was very, very worried at this point of the story, but I wondered if you could tell us what happened then in the pandemic and really this kind of remarkable transition.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is how I met them. So Ben was traveling because he and his friends wanted to memorialize a friend who had committed suicide. And it was something like 8 months after the death that they were finally able to all get together and do a little piece of Route 66, which was their tradition, and they had done this with their friend. And Route 66, the history is just, I have that in there too. Sorry, I apologize, I'm discursive. So you'll just have to either love it or hate it. Just go in knowing that I'm discursive. So they're out in Arizona, or I think at that point, maybe he's in Chicago. And he comes back home, they shut down the factory, they send all the workers home, they said, be with your families at this time, you don't know what's happening. And that's Saturday night, so I don't have the dates right, but it was right after it was declared a national emergency, whatever the sequence was. So it was that Saturday night. And Ben and Whitney are sitting on the sofa watching the news, and they're watching New York City. Do you remember? I mean, I don't wanna bring back those memories, but my brother was there. It was worse than a ghost town because people were dying. And we didn't understand how this disease spread. We didn't understand why it was so lethal. And what was happening in New York City is that the emergency rooms were completely overrun. And they had so many people dying so quickly that they couldn't keep up with even that. I mean, it was apocalyptic. And so they're watching this. And what's coming out of it is that China has shut down, and China is the provider of all of our protective gear. I go into why, but that's the fact. There's nobody making protective gear in America. Masks, gowns, surgical gowns, gloves, face shields, surgical hats, all the things that we put on, take off, throw away, put on, take off, throw away. All of that stuff was coming from China until it wasn't. And so what was the message was the nurses and the doctors and the hospital administrators were saying, we're gonna run out. We can tell you right now, we're gonna run out. We don't have a stockpile, we're gonna run out. And Whitney turns to Ben and she says, we make things. We can make this. And they have a phone call with the board the next day. And they said, their board. And they said, if we can figure out how to make the factory safe and design a mask, are you okay with us, opening the factory again? And the board said, go for it. And then they bring the workers back the following Monday. Again, this is March 2020. And they said, if we separate all the machines, lay down plastic, disinfect the joint, and design a mask. It was a jersey mask, a 2-layer jersey mask. Working with an expert. And if we ask you to come back to make this for first responders in America, will you do it? And remember, these are new Americans. These are people who just arrived in the United States. Many of them just 2, 3, 4 years prior. This is during the Trump administration. They're not welcome. Many of them are Muslim. Ben says to the group, 30 people, some of them can barely speak English. And he says, will you come back? And every single hand goes up. And they say, yes, we'll come back. And a man from Iraq, who's lovely, absolutely lovely. He had been an interpreter during the war in Iraq when the American military presence was withdrawn. He had a big target on his back. He had 3 children. He was one of the last people who was able to escape. He stood up and he said, we do this because we are American. It was really quite touching. And so they came back and they made masks. They made hundreds of thousands of masks for people in Maine, for people in New Jersey, for people in California. Like the orders just started coming in. And it was just an incredible time, and that's how I met them. I met them because I was working on a story for Down East magazine, which is a great magazine. Although they owe me money. And,
This is going out of their way, so.
Yes.
They asked me to find Maine-made masks in the summer of 2020 because, you know, I don't know if you remember, but everybody's pulling out sewing machines and pulling out bolts of fabric. I was too. I was cutting them. You know, you just make it. And God bless every single one of you who knew how to make stuff, right? I mean, a lot of people don't, but I was fortunate that I had a sewing machine. I had fabric. I was like, I'm gonna make this work. And I sent my husband and daughter out with these ridiculous masks, but that I just like improvised. I don't know. What does a face look like? I don't know. So, yeah. So they did this. They did this, and they produced an incredible number of masks, and they grew very quickly to 150 employees in just a couple of months. Which, if any of you are entrepreneurs, you know that that is really difficult
Just amazing.
to grow that fast.
Yeah, and it's an amazing story, and they were saving themselves by saving us. I mean, really, by taking a chance, they saved themselves to get through that pandemic. So even as we're being very compelled by this story, as I said, there's all kinds of bits of history and political theory and woven through this again on a kind of need as the reader needs to know basis. And you actually take on a lot of the ideas that we sort of think of as common sense. And one of them is really have in America, we just have this real worship of the idea of freedom. And you talk about that, well, nothing is free, including what you call free range capital. And I wonder if you would tell us about free range capital, only because it's so familiar to us that we probably don't recognize it. Mm-hmm. And then what it has to do with democratic stabilization or destabilization,
Yeah.
I suppose.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And now we're getting big. So the free range chickens and then there's free range capitalism. The two are not the same. But you can imagine a chicken being a capitalist. So what happened was when our first foray into free trade was NAFTA, right? The North American Free Trade Agreement, which was designed under Bush 1 and passed into law under Clinton in 1992. And it really started to kick in about 94. And that's when you start to see a lot of industry. I mean, it happened so fast that if you were in it, you saw it. If you weren't in it, you had no idea what was going on. It happened so fast that the industry just started offshoring. And of course, the first place it went was Mexico, which was part of the free trade agreement, and Canada to a certain extent, but mostly to Mexico because labor was so much cheaper. When the World Trade Organization then comes into being in 95, and then when China joins the World Trade Organization in, I'm going to say 2001, that's when it's just a bonanza. There was a real movement in America, you're probably familiar with this because we've all lived through it for the most part, to find cheaper places to make your dang stuff so that you could make a profit. And everybody did it. And we didn't think too hard about it because all of us were tied to our 401ks and our investments, and it was really good for Wall Street. Here's the problem, is that you've got brands now that are addicted to cheap labor. And so what they do is they come into a country, any country, where the economy is not good, and people will do almost anything to make money. And they come in and they pit factories against factories. So factory A and factory B, who will make it cheaper? Who will make it cheaper? So I'm talking about big brands like Nike, right? So they come in and they say, okay, factory A, you're making our sweatshirts, factory B, you're making our leggings or whatever. Now make it cheaper, now make it faster, now make it cheaper and faster. And it's just a race to the bottom. And if you lose, and everybody loses in this game, except Nike, although we're coming to that. When they start to lose, when the workers start to get empowered, or if there are environmental regulations that are slowing them down, then they move to another country. And that's free range capitalism. And we've seen it. Again, think of that stack of Gap. Nobody buys the Gap anymore. I don't know, H&M. You know, you just see country after country after country, and it's basically a history of free range capitalism, right? So the capitalism comes in, they make the minimal amount of investment, they pick factory against factory, worker against worker, you know, it's a race to the bottom, and then it leaves to find new sources of cheap labor. Now, what's really upsetting is that authoritarianism is on the rise among these countries that we thought if you roped them into capitalism that they would naturally go to democracy. That didn't happen. That didn't happen with China. That's not happening with Thailand. That's not happening with Cambodia. I know, as I mentioned, my brothers live in Asia, both of them. They're becoming more authoritarian. Why? Because there's this incredible concentration of wealth that's happening among the people who are helping the factories get those contracts, those lucrative, to a certain extent, contracts, that then, of course, have a tendency to explore mostly female laborers. So if you don't have protections, it's a continual race to the bottom. Now, here's what's interesting. Here's what's happening right now. It's a piece that I'm actually hoping to run in the LA Times. Is that actually these brands we're all about to get our comeuppance because especially China, I'm talking about China now, not because I have a specific problem with Chinese people, but because China plays the long game. And the long game is ultimately to make the world dependent on Chinese resources and products. It's a simple calculus because China wants to protect its people, just as America once did. Right? We used to have an industrial policy that protected our intellectual property, that protected our workers. China has really repeated what we're doing. Anyway, so what's happening now is that the Chinese are very good at making every single thing the Americans want, including now, thanks to Elon Musk, who is manufacturing Teslas in Shanghai. Now the Chinese are very good at making electric vehicles. But to make it a Chinese vehicle and bring it into the United States, they would be charged a 27% tariff, right? So then it almost is about the cost of an American-made vehicle. So the Chinese companies, the government, I don't know, it's sometimes one and the same, are building auto manufacturing plants in Mexico so that Chinese cars can be manufactured in Mexico and get into the United States under the terms of the U.S.A, which is Trump's version of NAFTA. And many experts believe that this would be the death knell to the American auto industry, which, by the way, employs at least 1 million people and is 2 to 3% of our GDP. And that's just one sector. When we talk about apparel and textiles, the Chinese companies have figured out ways to come direct into our homes. Forget Nike, forget H&M, forget the brands. There are now companies like TikTok Marketplace, Shein, and Temu. If you guys don't have teenagers, maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, but maybe you've seen the ads in the Super Bowl for Temu. These are Chinese Amazons, basically, that are selling products made in China, shipped direct to you, tariff-free. Tariff-free. And there are millions of packages coming into the United States every single day, tariff-free, and they are knockoffs of American branded goods. And it seems to me like very few people are paying attention.
Well, I want to make sure I get the wisdom of the audience here too. You started a little late, so it's okay if we'll go a little late if that's all right.
It's fine with me.
Yeah. I'm also conscious of your online audience, but I wonder if this has been great, great for me. I'm having a great time. But I want to get these folks in over here. Do we have questions, thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I have a comment, and it's still on topic, I think, with your architectural background. And the article you wrote in the Boston Globe about turning this unused office space post-COVID
Yeah.
into small manufacturing
Mhm.
spaces. So you drew on your architectural background too, but it's probably, I don't know how much of the problem it is, but finding a space to make these goods.
Yeah.
I mean, there you go.
Yeah, so I actually pitched this back in July, so it took all this time. If anybody wants to be a journalist or is a journalist, you know how long sometimes things take. But so the idea is we've got this really strong knowledge sector here now in Massachusetts, obviously. You've got, Harvard, BU, MIT, I don't have to list them all, you live here. And a lot of them are working in automation, AI, and robotics. And a lot of that knowledge is actually being used in the manufacturing sector, but not here, not so much here. And first of all, well, that's a shame. But secondly, it slows down the rate of innovation. Because what you really want to do is, as I said, create, test, take it apart, rebuild. Create, test, take it apart, rebuild. And so we, all around America, have many problems post-pandemic. One is we have office buildings now that are empty. And we have retail space that's pretty chronically empty, right? In small towns and big, everywhere, right? And so there are two kinds of manufacturing models that I think are really tremendous, and they're taking off in Europe and in all places around the United States, especially Pittsburgh, Baltimore. It's maker spaces at the retail level. So you have the atelier in the back, I call it atelier, it's a fancy word for workshop, and you have the retail space up front. And that could be a very exciting model for the ground level in Salem, in Boston, anywhere. But these makers need support, right? You need a whole system to support them, just as you need independent restaurants need a lot of support, right?
Independent bookstores.
Independent bookstores, everybody, when you're talking about ground floor retail, it takes a village to really make it all work. But what I was talking about specifically in terms of office buildings is that a lot of factories now are actually kind of prefab, right? So you're talking about high-end milling machines, you're talking about 3D printers, you're talking about precision manufacturing. It's small, and the machines that do that kind of work are tied to computers. So you're no longer talking about a lot of handwork, you're talking about programmers and people who work with these machines. Those things can be plugged right into office spaces.
It's not conveyor belts anymore,
Right.
where people are doing that, it's like Lucy.
Not smelting.
Yeah.
And then take that a step further. The biggest producers of waste, of course, are cities, just because it's like a huge concentration of human beings and we produce waste. And so you could actually create a whole circular economy where you have recycling processing plants on the outskirts of cities, then breaking down materials for use in these smaller manufacturing spaces in the city, producing things specifically that the city needs. So I'm focused on Boston because I live in Boston, but Boston has a huge, obviously, healthcare community, and oh my God, I mean, the amount of waste produced by hospitals is tremendous. And imagine, making some of the precision instruments like right there, And working again with hospitals, physicians, innovators, researchers to develop new instruments and technologies right there. You know, so you have, it's just like a perfect storm. I don't know why somebody's not doing it.
Well, maybe they will know, and I was struck by that article as well, and I read it before I knew it was you. Oh, Rachel. Because one of the things about those empty office buildings, so instantly people like me go, let's put housing,
Yeah.
and then to learn that it's actually really hard because of footprints and things like elevators and windows, I mean, stuff that people, I don't bother with details like that. But, so what could we use it for? And it was just a brilliant idea, yeah. Other thoughts, questions?
So I have yet to read the book, but I've read your article with great interest. And hearing you talk tonight, I'm reminded of where I grew up, Northeastern Ohio.
Yeah,
When I was in college, in the 90s. Northeastern Ohio was a really great tool and die and mold workshop manufacturing center.
yeah.
Global reach from weird little places. And in retrospect, I did watch NAFTA hollow even those custom shops out. You know, small run jobs built on micro-millimeters, manufacturing runs. That leaves me once bitten, twice shy, and therefore a little pessimistic.
Yeah.
About the rather exciting model you propose. What is to stop the water running out of the holes of the container in such a model?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that question, thank you for your history, and really straight with this. Yeah, so first of all, there is a ton of manufacturing going on right now in Massachusetts, and the New Hampshire lives on this. We think of New Hampshire as like mountains and forests, I don't know, I did anyway, until I did a little research, and it turns out they're doing tons of high-end precision manufacturing in New Hampshire. Who knew? Anybody know that? You knew that, okay. You knew. Thank you. But to slow it down, obviously, we need tariffs. So in the beginning of my book, thank you, Catherine, I have a fun little chart here. You can't see it, but on your way out, if you don't mind checking it out. And this is tariffs in the United States since 1820. And you'll see that they just plunged down to almost zero. So they were up to like 60% at moments on imported goods, right? And now we're down to like 3-4%. Thank you. And the reason that we had such high tariffs in the 1820s was because the first mission of the new United States was to figure out manufacturing and halt the import of British imported goods. We had to wean ourselves off of cheap imports from the British because they were our enemies. And that's why, you know, Salem exists, right? Because originally this was an import-export location, same with Boston. But we had to swivel to manufacture. So we had very high tariffs. It was all part of Alexander Hamilton's original plan to wean us off the cheap stuff, start making things for ourselves, and create an economy. And we let that go in the name of free trade, in the name of short-term profit. We let it go. You know, in the 1980s, starting in the 70s, but then really took off in the 80s. Let it go. We're going to be a knowledge and service economy now. We don't need to make things anymore. But as I hope I've demonstrated tonight, talking about some of these Chinese companies, the way you know we're going to be beaten at our own game, basically. And again, I'm not an American chauvinist, but it's just to prove a point. Like you're going to lose that in the long run if you're not producing the things that you need. Right? You are at the mercy of someone else. And while the prices may be low now, they won't always be low. They don't have to be. Once you are a captive audience, the prices can go anywhere, right? I mean, it's true. So
a monopsony at scale.
what?
A monopsony at scale.
What's a monopsony?
God, I'm terrible at this. I'm not an economist, I'm afraid, sorry.
Me too.
It's a captive market
Yeah,
where,
Okay,
the price can be set at will, good
Yeah.
what you do.
yeah, and that's ultimately what we're gonna see. So I think it's critical and, you know, it's gonna take a lot of balls for folks to raise tariffs, but it has to come in concert with an industrial plan. Biden actually developed a very comprehensive industrial plan. Much of it was taken out. Now it's mostly focused on, you know, the CHIPS Act, so it's like high-tech manufacturing. But I really think we need to broaden that scope, but first we need to read these stories to understand why it's important. It's like a lot of connecting of dots required to get there. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily gonna happen right away or fast enough, but at least you're here, you're listening to me.
Well, this is one more question
Sure.
So,
Constance.
a couple of comments on the question. So I actually used to make things, so,
Okay, thank you.
if anybody ever, you familiar with a product called corian?
Yes,
Yeah.
of course, I know Corey.
Well, I was one of the guys who helped figure out how to make some of those products.
Ah.
It was the kind of the ground particles, that was I was a chemical engineer back in the day.
Ah.
And all of that material came from the United States, we didn't import anything.
Huh.
But then I went to business school, so I went to the other dark side. I don't like private equity either. So I was working for a company out in Colorado and they wanted, the CEO wanted, it was a big company, company wanted to go to China. So I got a job to figure out a financial model, can we make money?
Mhm.
And so I said, well, you can't, because what you basically do is you say how much money, and then you have to discount it. In other words, you have to take into account risk. And at that time, nobody had ever taken $1 out of China. So, and if you're talking political risk, all those other things. And I went through, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 iterations and finally said, fuck it, we're going there anyway. So it was not always clear, but
Right.
us going to China
Yeah.
actually is a continuation. If you think about it, you talked about New England. You know, the mills, my father grew up in Dexter, Maine,
Okay,
worked at a
yeah.
woolen mill.
You're gonna love this.
I saw that in the book, so I kind of cheated. But then they all went to the southeast.
Yeah.
So they went, in the United States, there was that flight of capital
Mhm.
to cheaper parts of the country. This is the continuation. I'm actually a little bit more hopeful. Why?
Good.
I think you're gonna start to see onshoring. But the issue that is at the heart of this is the failure of our education system. Because what's happened is we succeed and still have the greatest economy in the world because our top 5 to 10% is still the best in the world. There's nobody who can compete with it. The trouble is the bottom 90% are average or below average. And so you have a huge skill deficit.
Mhm.
And when it used to be able to work in farms or other, you could make money with your back, those jobs are largely gone. And that's why we struggle, because we have an incompatibility. And until we get our education system fixed, it's gonna be tough.
So workforce training obviously is a huge.
Well, but it's more than that. When you have people who are, and I work for a company now, we hire a lot of people in Boston. When we're graduating functional illiterates, okay, who maybe can read at a 6th or 7th grade level, okay?
Mhm.
Their ability to do jobs
Mhm.
are significantly limited, and that's the challenge I think we have as a society,
Mhm.
is to really invest in our education system. Not just that people going to Harvard and MIT, et cetera, they will always be fine. But really, it's our education system that we've got to deal with. And I hate to say it, I think part of the issue is we as families, but also unions, the teacher unions, for whom accountability, they just want to get paid and get their tenure, okay? I'm sorry, but.
There are a lot of excellent union teachers.
Well-
And there are people.
You said you had a couple comments and a question. Did you have a question?
Yes, when did we have an industrial policy? You talked about, we used to have one, and I'm trying to remember when that was, because I can't.
I mean, we've had several. At the founding of the country, we developed an industrial policy that included the tariffs and workforce training and like
I'll give
figuring.
you the tariffs, the other stuff, I would disagree with that, that was maybe, people did it in,
Apprenticeships.
and that was a policy of the United States?
Yeah, there was a policy that we had a national bank that financed entrepreneurs. That was why they developed the first national bank of America.
And that was widely applied in the United States?
Well, it was the United States, like that was these were the first things that the United States had to do, because we were deep in debt after the revolution, you know, our uniforms, we bought them from the Dutch. Seriously. So we needed to figure out how to finance a whole industrial revolution. And we also needed to figure out how to do the industrial revolution because we weren't knowledgeable.
And that was at the federal level, because the only money the Fed made in those days was largely for tariffs, there's no income tax until 1913, I mean,
They tax various things, it's true.
it was a, I just kind of maybe see it there.
Well, personally, as an American historian, I think the invocation of Alexander Hamilton is our signal for a successful evening. And I thank you so much.
And thank you to you both, and you're all, we've been enlightened, and the book is wonderful, to your point. Oh, but just one more thing, could you show the inside flap
Oh,
that shows the journey of a sweatshirt?
Oh, my gosh, isn't that
It is
great?
so cool. So
Wow.
going to different states, but it's all in America.
It's all in America.
It's so easy
There
to.
we go. I'm gonna do like a real librarian. Doing with children. There we go.
Okay.
so I lobbied for that. I was like, we need this,
No, that's
so
great.
it's a limited edition. Only the first 20,000 copies. will be available.
Yeah, so you have to buy now. I'm not. Stop that.
Market, yeah, smart. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, it's really fun.
Of course.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for caring enough to come out to me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
And now we're all gonna look at the labels and tear them out.
Oh, on my website, by the way, which is rachelslade.net, I have like a huge list of American-made companies. Yes. So go to my website, you'll see it.
RachelSlade.net.
RachelSlade.net,
Okay.
and you'll find it. If you need help, just let me know. And yeah, so if you do have a compulsion now, oh my God, you can find almost anything made in the United States. You just need to know where to look for it. Oh, yeah, we do.
Ending on a hopeful note.
Yes.